Hello, I'm Nina, and in today's episode of Comments, I will be discussing FGM, female genital mutilation. I'd like to talk about female genital mutilation. In Britain, the NHS has recently announced they will be opening up female genital mutilation support clinics throughout the country to assist in providing medical help to deal with the psychological and obviously mental consequences of the victims of FGM, as it's abbreviated. However, what springs to mind is, although we have these clinics being set up to deal with these horrific crimes on young females, young children, apparently most of the victims are actually taken abroad during school holidays. The summer holidays are particularly popular periods where the children will be taken to a country where her genitals will be mutilated in the name of tradition or cultural tradition, where the practice is still commonplace. Now, the clinics, they've apparently been will offer education and support to communities, and assumedly this will be in specific cities targeting particular ethnicities where this female genital mutilation is prevalent and culturally still acceptable. There has been a lot of publicity around female genital mutilation. However, I don't feel there is enough education and information provided for parents of young children. It really needs to be better enforced that for female genitalia removal for non-medical purposes without the consent of an individual young child is absolutely, really horrifically barbaric, regardless of whether or not it's still commonplace, acceptable practice culturally in certain areas globally. However, if you're a resident, in the UK, the practice has been a criminal offence, for over 30 years, since 1985. You had the Prohibition of Female Circumcision Act. However, that was updated recently to the Female Genital Mutilation Act, back in 2003. Obviously, this has been a legal requirement that healthcare professionals and teachers report cases to the police, but it's very difficult to identify specifically the victims. It is luckily less prevalent than it used to be. However, there has only been, I believe, since the enactment of this legislation, there has only been one conviction recently of a mother of a girl who was 3 years old, becoming the first person to actually be convicted and found guilty of female genital mutilation in the UK. Now, again, these are all fairly taboo subjects which need to be really openly discussed in certain communities to really combat the reasons why this is conducted. Often this particular young lady, who's originally from Uganda, maintained, and the father was Ghanaian, of the young girl. And apparently it's regarding witchcraft and ensuring that there was no malevolence in them actually carrying out this particular onus, horrendous mutilation, female genital mutilation on the young child, disregarding their reasons for conducting it. What springs to mind is how certain communities still need to be re-educated. There hasn't been enough public information services or any kind of government information needs to be not just legislated, but it needs to be imparted into the communities, you know, specifically where this heinous crime is being committed, perhaps through really through ignorance, not understanding that this is actually illegal within the UK to conduct this, or it could be just through cultural reasons, again, because it is something that has been acceptable for hundreds of years within certain communities, and the practice is still continued and adhered to. It is something that the government really needs to campaign. There are organisations such as the Dahlia Project, other charities, Daughters of Eve, the Five Foundation, who are breaking down the barriers and taboo regarding discussing this really difficult subject. And I can appreciate, because of the nature of the topic, it can be something that people may feel that they are unable to discuss in the open. The clinics will predominantly be working also in conjunction with providing medical assistance, but they will be also devising education and prevention programs in communities where it has been identified there is the greatest need in certain cities throughout the UK, from London, obviously, in certain boroughs, Birmingham, Bristol, Leeds. Again, they're large cities in the UK where this it's been identified that this particular awful practice is still highly prevalent in the communities. There is no firm solution for ending FGM other than to deter potential culprits, parents from or relatives from, and medical workers from performing it. Although it has probably deterred and the conviction of this lady has probably deterred the any medical practitioners of carrying it out in this particular country, children are still being taken abroad, overseas, for the practice to be carried out. So again, it's not as much about educating the parents as it is as well to provide information within schools to children to advise them that this is unacceptable and you should say no. And if you know that it may be happening to your siblings or anyone else that you know, then you should report it and, you know, provide guidance as to how to contact the necessary people, whether it's to talk to a teacher or whether it's to talk to the NSPCC call the Childline Helpline, because young children need to also be made aware that they do not need to be victims of this heinous crime, and that it isn't acceptable at all. It is something that, especially, it's absolutely astounding that the legislation has been in place for so many years, but to date, as I recall, there's only been one firm conviction, and that is really telling, because it means that the practice is really not exposed as much as it should be, and it's difficult to collate evidence to prosecute, especially if it's undertaken overseas. However, if there is an accusation of FGM being carried out, then it should be thoroughly investigated. And more importantly, in the UK, we need to break the cycle of violence against women and children and girls being given a voice. A lot of FGM survivors are speaking out and becoming more vocal and speaking about the subject in the media. However, there's not enough being done within the actual communities themselves to challenge fathers and husbands to change their attitudes, as well as the mothers, because usually it will be one or both parents who will actually enforce and perpetrate this particular practice. As I said, it's done usually with their consent, and of course no one community can actually claim to have the moral high ground. Just because it's common practice in certain countries does not mean that it is acceptable within the UK, and that is something that can only be challenged through a programme intensifying the education programme and changing attitudes of young British girls born to mothers within the UK, and deterring families from taking them overseas to conduct this practice. Hopefully awareness is growing. It was a subject that perhaps 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, wasn't so much in the public domain. It wasn't something that was ordinarily people would be aware of. However, there is a zero tolerance now to FGM, and especially in the UK, the NHS medical workers, doctors, teachers are also far more aware of the practice, and to detect the victims who may have been subjected to this. But again, the momentum needs to continue as we strive to end it once and for all, especially within other communities overseas, as well as the communities resident within the UK. Okay. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. You can subscribe to the Commons podcast via iTunes, Spotify, and other major providers.